The rain didn't stop, but neither did she. The battlefield was quiet now, only the distant hum of artillery in the air. It had been hours since the chaos had subsided, yet the quiet still felt foreign. The air smelled of damp earth, but it couldn't mask the thick scent of blood that lingered in the trenches. Anna Weiss, a German nurse who had once been an auxiliary in the midst of the war, stood motionless in the downpour, her face a mask of concentration. The rain clung to her uniform, dripping down in steady rivulets as her hands remained firmly placed on the injured soldier's chest, trying to steady his breathing. The soldier's name was James, a young man no older than 20, his eyes barely open. Anna had seen countless injured men in her time as a nurse, but this one, this American soldier, was different. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of the situation. Her job was to save lives, no matter the side. And yet, here she was, with his blood staining her gloves, trying to keep him alive in a world that told her she should be his enemy. The officer stood behind her, his voice stern, as though her actions could somehow disrupt the order of things. "Step back," Captain Robert Hayes commanded, his voice cutting through the rain. "She's a prisoner of war. We need to move her away." Anna didn't look up. She didn't respond. She simply kept her hands where they were, applying the pressure that was needed, trying to steady the soldier's fragile pulse. There was a moment of silence, the officer's words hanging in the thick air. He repeated himself, louder this time. "I said, stop. You're a prisoner. You don't have the authority to make decisions here." Anna's eyes never left the soldier's face. She could feel the weight of his words, but they didn't reach her heart. There was something bigger than authority in this moment, humanity. Slowly, as if to let the officer's commands sink in, Anna shifted her weight, but only for a moment. She wasn't moving away. She wasn't stopping. The soldier's breath came in shallow gasps, and she knew it was a race against time. She had seen it before, the way a body fights for survival, the way it pleads for just one more breath. Captain Hayes shifted on. His feet, uncertain, but the sight of the soldier's struggle made something inside him pause. He stood there, arms crossed, watching her. The rain poured harder now, but still, Anna didn't flinch. She was a prisoner in this war, but in this moment, she was also the one with the power to save a life. Hayes opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. The soldier's eyes fluttered open briefly, locking eyes with Anna, as though he understood that she was his only chance. Slowly, Hayes exhaled, his shoulders slumping just slightly, his authority crumbling in the face of what truly mattered. He turned away, silent. "Let her finish," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Anna didn't acknowledge him, nor did she need to. She simply did what she had always done, she held on, and she helped him breathe. The rain fell harder now, but Anna's grip never wavered. She could feel the soldier's heartbeat slowing beneath her hands, a rhythmic thud that seemed to echo through the cold, damp air. Her breath was steady, her thoughts focused on nothing but the task at hand. She could hear the distant murmur of voices, the shuffle of boots in the mud, but it all felt distant. In this moment, it was just her and the soldier, just the delicate, fragile thread of life she was desperately trying to keep intact. Captain Hayes stood back, watching. He didn't speak, didn't move. His eyes were locked on Anna's back, but his mind was elsewhere, torn between his duty and something deeper. He had been a soldier long enough to know the value of rules, the importance of order, but there was something about this situation that made him question everything. The soldier beneath Anna's hands was just a boy, a kid who hadn't even seen his 21st birthday. He was no different from the other soldiers he had seen fall, no different from the ones he had left behind in distant battles. And yet, there was something about this moment that made it feel different, something about Anna's quiet defiance, her refusal to follow orders, that shook him to his core. The wind whipped through the air, the rain stinging his face, but it wasn't enough to clear the confusion in his mind. Anna was a prisoner. She was supposed to be the enemy. But here she was, saving the life of the very soldier who might have killed her if the circumstances were different. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the weight of the choice between authority and humanity. He looked down at the mud, the water pooling around his boots, and for a brief moment, he wondered what would have happened if things had been different. If Anna had been American, if she had been on his side. Would he have treated her the same? Would he have ordered her to stop? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft groan from the soldier beneath Anna's hands. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the sound. Her focus remained unwavering. Slowly, the soldier's chest rose and fell with more ease, his breath becoming less labored, the color beginning to return to his face. Anna didn't take her hands away, didn't stop pressing. She simply held on. After what felt like an eternity, Captain Hayes took a step forward. He still didn't speak, but he moved closer, standing beside her, watching the slow but steady improvement in the soldier's condition. He was still struggling to understand why she had defied him, why she had ignored his orders. But as he watched her work, as he saw the care and determination in her eyes, he realized that there was no place for orders here. There was only the fragile life that hung in the balance. "You can stop now," Hayes said quietly, his voice soft, almost reluctant. Anna looked up for the first time, her eyes meeting his. She didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge the command. She simply nodded and, with a final breath, pulled her hands away. The soldier stirred, his breathing now steady, and Anna stepped back, her face expressionless but her heart racing. Hayes stood in silence, still unsure of what had just happened. He had seen many battles, many injuries, many lives saved, but this moment felt different. There was no glory, no victory to claim here. There was only the quiet, unspoken understanding that, in this moment, humanity had triumphed over authority. The rain had finally stopped, but the air remained thick with moisture, the ground slick and muddy beneath their boots. The quiet was overwhelming, the only sound now the distant murmur of voices and the occasional rustle of rain-soaked leaves. Captain Hayes stood still, watching Anna as she moved to the side, allowing the medics to take over. She didn't speak, didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were distant, focused on something far beyond the chaos of the camp, something that only she understood. Hayes felt a strange pull in his chest, a mix of confusion and admiration. She had ignored his orders, defied his authority without a word, and yet, here she was, helping. He had been trained to see prisoners as enemies, to treat them with suspicion, to uphold the rules at all costs. But in this moment, Anna had shown him something he hadn't expected to see. She had shown him a glimpse of humanity. He couldn't explain it, didn't know how to reconcile what he had seen with what he had been taught. It wasn't just her skill as a nurse. It was the way she had chosen to act in that moment, the quiet decision to ignore the rules and focus on saving a life. And it wasn't just the soldier she had helped, it was him, too. Anna had unknowingly given him something that he hadn't realized he needed, a reminder of what truly mattered. As the medics took the soldier away to safety, Hayes took a step toward Anna, his boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. There was no manual for this. No orders to follow. "You saved him," Hayes said quietly, his voice almost lost in the stillness. Anna didn't respond, but she turned to face him. Her eyes were cold, but there was something else there, something he couldn't quite place. "You did the right thing," he continued, his voice softer now. She didn't answer, but he could see the faintest hint of something in her gaze. Maybe it was relief, maybe it was something deeper, but it was there, in the briefest of moments. Hayes didn't know what to say next, so he just stood there, unsure, watching her. She was a prisoner, and yet she had defied him without a second thought, without hesitation. He wondered if she had ever once questioned her role in this war, her place in the world. If she had ever wondered what she was fighting for. He didn't have the answers, not for her, and not for himself. He had always thought war was about lines, about sides, about enemies and allies. But Anna had shown him something else, something he hadn't known existed. In that brief moment, as she saved a life, she had blurred those lines. She had shown him that humanity couldn't be defined by flags or uniforms. It was something deeper, something that connected them all, no matter where they came from or what side they were on. He watched as she turned away, her figure disappearing into the distance, her step steady, her back straight. He didn't call out to her. He didn't try to stop her. Instead, he stood there, staring at the empty space she had left behind, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. It was the first time he had ever truly questioned the rules he had been taught to follow. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which side of the line he was on. The days after the incident were strangely quiet. The camp seemed to breathe a little slower, as if the events of that day had left something in the air, something unspoken. Captain Hayes found himself standing at the edge of the compound, watching the horizon, his thoughts tangled in a way they had never been before. He had spent his career keeping the lines clear, us versus them, allies versus enemies. But now, after what he had witnessed, those lines were no longer so obvious. Anna was different from the others. She didn't belong to the usual categories he had been trained to see. He had expected resistance, defiance, perhaps even anger. But what he had seen from her was something else entirely. Her defiance wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. It was quiet, controlled, a subtle rejection of the roles that had been assigned to them both. And it stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts every time he closed his eyes. He watched her from a distance as she continued her work, moving with a quiet grace that seemed almost at odds with the chaos around her. She didn't look at him anymore, didn't acknowledge him, but he couldn't stop thinking about the way she had kept her hands on that soldier. The way she had ignored his orders, not out of spite, but out of something deeper, something that felt more real than the authority he had tried to assert. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the muddy ground, Hayes found himself walking toward the barracks where Anna was. He wasn't sure why he was doing it. Maybe it was the need to understand. Maybe it was the curiosity that had begun to burn inside him. He had seen so many prisoners, so many people broken by the war, but she was different. He stopped just outside the entrance, watching her as she moved among the others, offering help, giving care, not with words, but with actions. It was something he had never truly understood until now, how simple acts of kindness could be the most powerful form of defiance in a world turned upside down. He hesitated, unsure of what to do, before slowly approaching her. Anna didn't turn when he stopped a few paces away. She had already known he was there. Without looking up, she spoke softly, her voice steady and calm. "You're still here, Captain." Hayes nodded, his throat tight. "I wanted to see if you were, all right." There was no hint of surprise in her voice, no expectation of anything. She simply continued to move, helping another soldier adjust his bandages. "I'm fine," she said, her gaze never leaving her task. He stood there for a moment, watching her hands move, the quiet precision with which she worked. The weight of the moment hung in the air between them, and for the first time, he felt as though the rules he had followed for so long were no longer enough. He wasn't sure if it was the stillness of the night or the way the light fell on her face, but in that moment, he saw something more in her than he had before. She wasn't just a prisoner. She wasn't just a nurse. She was someone who, despite everything, chose to act with kindness and conviction. She had nothing left to fight for but the lives of the people around her, and in that, she had found a kind of strength that he could never fully understand. Hayes opened his mouth to say something, to ask her something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he found himself standing in silence, watching her. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the man in control. He didn't feel like the officer. He just felt like a man, standing next to someone who had reminded him of what really mattered. And as he turned to walk away, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already seen everything he needed to know. The days that followed were quieter. The tension in the air had shifted, and Captain Hayes felt it every time he walked through the camp. There was no more shouting, no more rigid commands. Instead, the camp seemed to hum with an unspoken understanding that something had changed. For the first time since the war had started, Hayes found himself questioning the simple rules that had governed his life. He could no longer look at Anna the same way. She wasn't just a prisoner. She wasn't just a nurse. She had become a reminder of the fragility of the lines they all drew in the sand. One evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to emerge, Hayes found himself walking down the narrow path that led to the small barracks where Anna stayed. He wasn't sure why he kept doing this. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't put into words. He stopped just outside, watching the shadows move within. He could see her, just inside the doorway, her silhouette faint against the dim light. She was speaking softly with one of the other prisoners, her tone calm, measured, like she had been doing this her entire life, caring for others, regardless of who they were. Hayes leaned against the wall, watching. He had always believed in the rules, in the structure of command, in the belief that they were the ones who held the power. But now, he wasn't so sure. Every time he saw Anna, every time he watched her move among the other prisoners, he couldn't help but feel that power slipping away. She had a quiet strength that he had never known. A strength that didn't come from rank or uniform, but from something much deeper. And it unsettled him. The door creaked open, and Anna stepped out, her figure framed by the soft light behind her. She didn't look at him immediately, but he could feel her awareness of his presence. She had known he was there. "Captain," she said, her voice steady, not surprised to see him. He nodded, unsure of what to say, of how to address the unspoken tension that hung between them. He had never been good with words, never good at expressing what he was feeling. "You're still out here, watching," she said, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a quiet recognition, as though she had seen this all before. "I thought you might be different," he said, his words awkward but sincere. She raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanged. "Different?" she asked, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "In what way?" Hayes struggled to find the right words. He wanted to say that he had thought she would be like the others, resistant, angry, defiant. But she wasn't. She was something else entirely. "I thought you might want to fight," he said finally. "I thought you'd resist, that you'd hate us." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady, and then she spoke again. "I've fought for a long time, Captain," she said quietly. "But fighting isn't always about anger. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stop, when to do what's right, even when it's hard." He didn't know how to respond to that. He had always seen the world in black and white, in terms of what was right and what was wrong. But Anna had shown him that there were shades of gray, that what was right wasn't always so easy to define. "You've made me see things differently," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do with that." Anna looked at him for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "You don't have to do anything, Captain," she said softly. "You just have to understand. And that's enough." She turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the shadows. Hayes stood there, alone in the silence, feeling something shift within him, something he couldn't name. The rules that had defined his world seemed so much less certain now. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: Anna had changed him, in ways he could never have imagined. And for the first time, he wasn't sure where the lines were anymore. The camp felt different now, quieter in a way that unsettled Captain Hayes. The sounds of orders being given and soldiers marching had faded into the background, replaced by something more introspective. It was as if the war itself had taken a back seat, leaving room for thoughts and questions that Hayes had never dared ask before. He found himself standing at the edge of the compound again, staring into the distance, but his thoughts were no longer on the horizon or the mission. They were on her. Anna had left a mark on him, one he couldn't ignore. Her quiet strength, her refusal to be defined by the circumstances of war, had stirred something inside him. It wasn't just that she had saved a life, though that in itself was remarkable, it was the way she had done it. Without anger. Without hatred. Simply by doing what was right. He had never thought much about what was right or wrong outside the framework of duty. He had always believed in the rules, the chain of command, and the clear lines that separated good from evil. But now, those lines seemed blurry, like a fog that had rolled in and refused to clear. Hayes was interrupted from his thoughts by a familiar figure walking across the compound. Anna. She moved with the same steady grace, her eyes focused on the task ahead. He hadn't expected to see her again so soon, but there she was, like she had never left. She didn't look at him as she passed, but he could feel her presence, feel the weight of the silent understanding between them. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt too heavy. Too insufficient. He watched her until she disappeared inside one of the tents. A part of him wanted to follow, wanted to understand her better, but another part of him held back. She was a prisoner. She had a role to play in this war, just as he did. Yet, it was becoming harder to see her as just that. Just another face in the crowd of prisoners. He walked toward the tent, his steps slow but determined. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but he knew that he couldn't keep avoiding the truth. He had to understand. As he reached the entrance, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the flap. He could hear the faint sounds of movement inside, but there was no sign of Anna. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the flap aside and stepped inside. She was kneeling on the floor, tending to a group of injured soldiers. Her back was turned to him, and she didn't seem to notice his presence. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her work. She moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Her hands were steady, her focus unwavering. It struck him then, how much of herself she had given to this. To these men, to the mission, to whatever she believed was right. She was more than just a prisoner. She was someone who had found purpose in the chaos. Anna, Hayes said, his voice quiet, almost tentative. She didn't look up at first. She just finished applying a bandage to one of the soldiers before turning her attention to him. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she said nothing. There was no judgment in her gaze, no accusation. Just silence. I don't understand, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand how you can do this, after everything. Anna paused for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then she spoke, her voice steady but soft. Because someone has to. The simplicity of her answer hit him harder than he expected. He had expected something more complicated, something that justified her actions, explained her choices. But instead, she had given him something so simple, so human. Someone has to do what's right, she added. No matter the cost. Hayes stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Her words hung in the air between them, settling into the space where his doubts had been. He had spent so long believing that the world was defined by lines, by orders, by duties. But now, in front of him, Anna had shown him a different kind of strength. A strength that came not from authority or power, but from compassion. And in that moment, Hayes realized that maybe, just maybe, the lines weren't as important as he had thought. The days blurred together after that conversation, as if the world had settled into a slower rhythm, one that Hayes couldn't quite keep up with. The camp seemed quieter, its usual sense of urgency dampened by something he couldn't name. He spent his time walking the grounds, his eyes always lingering on the prisoners, especially Anna. It was like seeing them through a different lens now. He couldn't stop thinking about her words. Someone has to do what's right, no matter the cost. It was simple, but it resonated with him in ways he hadn't expected. The complexity of the world he had known seemed to fade, replaced by something more direct. The next few days felt like a quiet struggle inside him. He noticed things he hadn't seen before, the way the prisoners moved, the way they spoke, the subtle shifts in their eyes when they interacted with the soldiers. He had never paid attention to these small details, too caught up in the logistics of war, in the rules and orders that dictated everything. But now, they stood out, and it unsettled him. He found himself watching Anna more than he should have. She didn't notice him, or if she did, she didn't acknowledge it. She moved among the prisoners like she belonged there, her focus always on the work. It was as if she had found a place for herself in a world that had no place for people like her. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Hayes found himself once again standing near the tent where Anna was working. He didn't mean to be there, but somehow, his feet had taken him in that direction. He could hear her voice, soft and steady, as she spoke to one of the soldiers. She was helping him with his bandages, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. There was a calmness in the way she worked, a kind of peace that Hayes couldn't quite explain. He stood just outside the entrance, watching her. She didn't see him at first, and for a moment, he allowed himself to just watch. There was no anger in her actions, no resentment. She wasn't there because she had to be. She was there because she chose to be. She had chosen to care, to help, even when everything around her told her to do the opposite. It struck him then, how much power she held. Not in the way she defied orders, but in the way she chose to be kind in the face of everything that had happened. She had seen the worst of humanity and still chose to be the best of it. Anna finished with the soldier, her hands moving with a practiced ease as she stepped back, giving him space to rest. Hayes took a deep breath, his heart beating a little faster. She had no idea how much she had changed him, how much he had begun to question. She was more than just a prisoner, more than just a nurse. She was a reflection of something he had lost sight of, a reminder of what truly mattered. As she stood, Anna finally looked up and saw him standing there. She didn't seem surprised, didn't flinch. Her expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him feel, for the first time in a long time, that he wasn't the one in control. "Captain," she said, her voice as calm as always. He didn't know how to respond. What could he say to someone who had shown him so much without even trying? "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said finally, his voice uncertain. "You didn't," she replied simply. And just like that, the moment passed. She turned away, walking back to where the others were gathered, her step steady and sure. Hayes stood there for a moment longer, watching her leave. He didn't know what to do with the feelings that had begun to stir inside him. He didn't know how to move forward, how to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming. But he knew one thing, Anna had opened his eyes to something he could no longer ignore. The camp seemed to grow quieter with each passing day, but Hayes couldn't escape the shift inside himself. He walked the grounds as he always had, but his eyes no longer saw the world the same way. Every glance at the prisoners, every move Anna made, was filled with the weight of his newfound understanding. The rules that had once seemed so clear, the lines between right and wrong, now felt as if they were fading into the shadows. His duty was still clear, he was an officer, sworn to uphold order, but there was a part of him that no longer believed the answers lay in the rigid structure he had been taught to follow. Anna, in her quiet way, had shaken that belief. She had shown him that the lines were never as clear as he had once thought. She moved with a calm certainty that came from a place deeper than mere survival. It was as if she had decided long ago that no matter the circumstances, no matter the position she was forced into, she would continue to do what was right. Hayes stood by the gate one morning, watching as she helped the other prisoners prepare for the day. Her hands moved with the fluidity of someone who had spent years in a constant state of care and service, without asking for anything in return. The camp was beginning to feel more like a place of survival than a place of conflict, a strange mixture of routine and purpose. The soldiers were getting used to the rhythm of the camp, and the prisoners, too, were finding their roles, adapting to their new lives. Yet, even as time passed, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The morning was still early, the sun barely breaking through the clouds, when he saw Anna once again. She was kneeling beside one of the soldiers, her face focused as she cleaned a wound on his leg. There was no urgency in her movements, only quiet care. Hayes hesitated before stepping forward. He hadn't spoken to her much since their last encounter, but something inside him urged him to approach. "Anna," he said softly, not wanting to break the quiet of the moment. She looked up at him, her expression unchanged. She had a way of looking at him, as if she saw right through him, into something he hadn't quite figured out yet. "Captain," she replied, as if she had been expecting him. "You're always so quiet," he said, his voice filled with something he didn't fully understand. "I don't understand how you do it." She paused for a moment, as if considering his words. "Do what?" she asked, her tone calm, almost detached. "How do you keep going?" he asked. "How do you keep helping when everything's falling apart?" She looked at him, her eyes steady, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something that wasn't just kindness, but an understanding of what it meant to endure. "Because that's all we can do," she said simply. "We can't change everything. But we can make a difference, even if it's small. One person at a time." Hayes didn't know how to respond. He had always believed in big gestures, in sweeping changes, in victory. But Anna's words made him realize that maybe it wasn't about changing the world. Maybe it was about doing what you could, where you were, with what you had. "I don't know if I'll ever understand you," Hayes said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Anna gave him a small smile, a rare thing, and for a moment, Hayes saw her not as a prisoner or a nurse, but as a person, someone with her own quiet strength. "You don't have to," she said softly. "You just have to see." And in that moment, Hayes understood. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to understand everything. He just needed to see. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to truly see. He watched as Anna stood, her movements graceful and deliberate, as she went to help another soldier. He knew, in that moment, that something inside him had shifted. He wasn't the same man who had arrived here. He wasn't the same man who had followed orders without question. He was something different, something more, and it was because of her. Anna had shown him that humanity wasn't about rules or authority, it was about the choices we made, the small acts of kindness we gave to others, even in the darkest of times. As the weeks passed, the world outside the camp seemed to continue on in its familiar rhythm, but inside, things had changed. The prisoners, once mere faces in the crowd, now felt like individuals to Captain Hayes. He found himself thinking about them more often than he cared to admit, particularly Anna. Her quiet strength had begun to seep into his own actions, shaping the way he moved through the world. He was no longer just an officer, barking orders to those beneath him. He had started to see the men and women in his charge as people, as human beings with their own stories, their own struggles. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hayes found himself once again walking toward the area where Anna worked. The light was soft, casting long shadows across the camp, and the sounds of the day were slowly fading into the night. He paused at the edge of the makeshift medical tent, watching as Anna bent over her task, tending to the wounded. It was always this way, calm, methodical, without hesitation. He had seen it 100 times, but each time felt like the first. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and each encounter with her left him questioning more of what he had once accepted as truth. "Anna," he said quietly, not sure what had compelled him to speak, but knowing that he had to. She looked up, her expression unreadable, but there was a softness in her eyes when they met his. "Captain," she said, her voice steady, offering no surprise at his presence. She had become accustomed to his visits, though they were never frequent. He hesitated for a moment, not knowing how to explain the thoughts swirling in his mind. "I keep thinking about what you said," he began, his words slow and unsure. "About doing what's right, no matter the cost." Anna remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I don't know how you do it," he said, his voice rougher now, the weight of his confusion evident. "After everything, after all that's happened, how do you keep choosing to be kind?" Anna didn't immediately answer. She looked down at her hands, wiping them on a cloth, before meeting his gaze once again. Because it's the only thing we can control, she said softly. We can't control the war, or the things that happen to us. But we can choose how we treat others. That's something no one can take away. Hayes stood there for a long moment, her words settling into his mind like a stone sinking into water. The simplicity of what she said, the quiet wisdom in it, felt like a revelation. For so long, he had believed that power came from control, from having the authority to make others follow. But Anna had shown him that true power, real strength, came from within, from the choices you made when you didn't have to, from the kindness you gave even when it seemed like the world had turned its back on you. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this way, so uncertain, so aware of the limitations of what he had known. Anna had made him realize that there was more to life than duty, more to it than following orders. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand, he said finally, his voice quiet. But I think I'm starting to see. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that spoke more of understanding than of anything else. That's enough, she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of its own. You don't have to understand everything. Just keep seeing. Hayes nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace settle in his chest. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from victory or accomplishment. It was something deeper, something quieter. He turned to walk away, but before he could go, Anna spoke again, her voice just above a whisper. You're not like the others, she said. He didn't turn around, but the words stuck with him, echoing in his mind long after he had left the tent. He didn't know what it meant, not fully, but he felt it, deep within himself. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to become the man Anna had always seen in him. A man who could choose kindness, who could see the humanity in others, and who could do what was right, no matter the cost.